This is the Sinden Lightgun, probably the most well-known light gun controller which works with modern displays. Originally crowdfunded through a Kickstarter campaign back in 2019, it's now commercially available to buy directly through the Sinden website, and they've proven so popular that Sinden technology is even being used in collaboration with companies such as Arcade1Up for their light gun cabinets. Things have clearly come a long way over these past few years for Andrew Sinden, the creator of the Sinden Lightguns, but as somebody who loves light gun games and even has a CRT set up specifically to play them, how does this thing compare to the real deal, and is it worth the price of admission? Let's find out. The unboxing experience is actually really straightforward. Inside the packaging, all you have is a couple of sections of soft padding to protect the gun during transit, and of course, the gun itself. There's no physical instructions, but instead the box tells you to head over to the official website for some setup information and to download the software and drivers. Before we tackle that though, let's take a look at the build quality of the gun. It's a hell of a lot more weighty than I thought it would be, which is potentially because of the recoil function. But because of this, it feels extremely premium. It has 4 side buttons, which is extremely handy for games that require the use of an additional input like Time Crisis with its cover mechanic. It has a D-pad which is extremely useful for navigating menus, and it even has this pump action effect which I absolutely love. Having a moving part like this really gives the gun that extra bit of pizzazz. And something else worth praising is the fact that the USB cable which powers the gun is really long, meaning it's absolutely suited to playing in a large room with a big TV. This is probably the single longest controller wire that I've ever seen. But it's at this stage that I'm a little bit worried. I've heard that the Sinden Lightguns are incredible, but that they require a lot of tinkering around with settings to get them to work properly. Now I am not a big fan of tinkering, and more often than not, I end up not being able to get anything working as it's supposed to, or I just end up stressing myself out so much that I'm not having a good time. But to be honest, despite the Sinden's reputation, it really isn't all that tough to get up and running. The Sinden Software has a very minimal design, and as a result could potentially look a bit overwhelming at first, but once you start delving into the settings, you'll quickly realise that it's not that bad. The Sinden Lightgun works by using a camera pointing out of the barrel of the gun, which is programmed to detect a white border which the software will create around your display. By moving the gun around, it will emulate a mouse, which is how the Sinden is made compatible with every single game and emulator. It's basically replicating what it would be like to play a light gun game by just moving the mouse cursor and clicking on things, but because it's a physical gun which you're aiming at the screen, it feels much more authentic than that. One of the most important features is that you can actually rebind all of the Sinden's inputs, from the 4 side buttons, the pump action forend, and the trigger. It goes way beyond simply rebinding controls though, because here you can also completely manually control the camera settings to ensure it's compensating for a particularly bright room or a dark display. You can customize the look of the border around the screen, you can calibrate your aim if something doesn't feel quite right, and you can even customize the strength of the recoil effect or outright turn this off, providing that you have the version of the gun with recoil. What's great too is that most of these settings can actually be saved to not only the software, but to the gun's internal memory too. So if you were to use the gun across multiple devices, it should remember your setup details across every device you're using. Now that is attention to detail. So you've got everything up and running and you're ready to fire up a game and get started. Unfortunately, this is where you'll probably encounter some issues. The problem isn't with the Sinden Lightgun or even the software itself, but it's that many games and emulators simply aren't designed with Sinden compatibility in mind. Even a brand new light gun game such as the House of the Dead remake doesn't feature native Sinden support, and I find this completely baffling considering that it's literally a game made entirely around a light gun. You can get it working by rebinding the controls to the gun, however even then things don't feel quite right. When I was aiming to the side, the accuracy was way off. But again, this isn't an issue with the gun, but rather the game. People have made patches to get the game fully working with the Sinden, which is great, but this function should be baked into the game as standard. However, I suspect that if you're anything like me, you're not buying a Sinden Lightgun to play new games, you're buying it to revisit those retro classics. Once again, things are a little bit complicated here too. Setting up the Sinden using the official software is easy, but setting it up inside an emulator or front end can be a little bit more daunting. I ended up following a guide on the very helpful Sinden wiki to get the gun working through RetroArch, and it turns out that there's actually quite a lot of settings you need to fiddle with here. This was by far the most difficult part of the setting up process, and I found that I had to deviate from the guide at times to get things working perfectly for my particular setup. But it is worth it in the end, because after doing this, you'll have access to basically any console Lightgun games. I've played a lot of Point Blank, Time Crisis, and the House of the Dead 2 with the Sinden, and it works almost perfectly. If I was being very nitpicky, I would say that sometimes when you're aiming right towards the edge of the screen, it doesn't quite register the exact point you're trying to shoot. However, this issue is pretty infrequent and is by no means a deal breaker at all. Something you might not like about using the Sinden guns though is the fact that, as I mentioned before, there does have to be a big white border around everything while you're using the Sinden. For me, I don't mind this at all and I kinda just ignore it and focus on the gameplay, but for some people I can imagine this would be slightly distracting. In terms of accuracy, I have to say that this thing is really, really good. Minigames in Point Blank, which involve shooting specific points on a target or shooting something without missing, normally cause me a lot of problems playing on actual hardware, but with the Sinden, I was actually finding these to be really easy thanks to its synchronization being perfect. The recoil effect is a really nice addition which replicates how certain arcade light guns would kick back when you shoot, although I do have to admit that personally I prefer playing with this turned off because it's a little bit distracting, but the fact that it's there at all is awesome. The pump action effect is really smooth and I used this to reload in games like the House of the Dead 2, but if you happen to not like this, you can opt to shoot off of the screen to reload instead, with the off-screen inputs being totally customizable to suit your needs. Damn, this thing is good, like it's really good. The only little negatives I have to say about it is that the initial setup process is quite tricky, and that when you're aiming towards the edges of the screen, sometimes the aiming does go a bit wonky. However, I wouldn't be surprised if there was some settings that I could go into to change something to make this issue a little bit better. So, would I recommend the Sinden Lightgun? Hell yeah, I would. There's a reason that this is the most well-known modern light gun, and while it's not quite a plug-and-play situation, that almost works to its benefit in a way, because it gives you far more customization options by giving you access to a ton of settings. Really, the biggest problem currently facing the Sinden light guns isn't even Sinden's fault. What we need is for the creators of all of these games, emulators, front ends, and arcade machines to make preset configurations for the Sinden guns, because if that element of the setting up process was eliminated, it would make things so much easier. As far as I'm aware, the Arcade Legends Ultimate is completely incompatible with the Sinden light guns, which is a massive shame because having that proper light gun arcade setup would be amazing. The Sinden light guns do actually work on original PlayStation hardware. However, to get this working requires additional accessories and seems a little bit too complex for me to want to try right now. And when I already have access to the original guns and a CRT, there's not too much of a reason for me to go down that route. However, this is now my go-to way of experiencing emulated console and arcade light gun games. But here's the big question: how much do these things cost? Well, for a basic model, it'll set you back £90, and the only difference here is that the basic version doesn't feature the recoil effect. It's £140 for a version with recoil, or you can get discounted double packs for some multiplayer action. These cost £170 £170 for 2 of the basic models and £270 for 2 of the recoil ones. There's also some optional extras like a holster to attach to an arcade machine or a pedal to use with games like Time Crisis. Oh, and the guns come in 4 different colours too. I went for a grey one so it matches the gun comp for the PS1. But the bottom line here is, yeah, the guns are quite expensive, but they are premium products and clearly have a lot of technology crammed into them, and to be honest, you can tell that a ton of passion was put into them too. So even though it is slightly pricey, I actually think that it's worth it if you're a light gun fanatic like me. And that wraps up my thoughts on the fantastic Sinden Lightgun. A massive thanks goes out to Sinden for sending us a sample unit to review, but let me know what you think. Are you tempted to pick up a Sinden Lightgun, or do you already have one, and if so, what's your experience with it been like so far? And also, definitely let us know if there's any other modern light guns that you think we should be taking a look at. And of course, give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more retro content coming very soon, and I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and I'll see you in the next one.